Hello, everybody, and welcome to another episode of Moving into the Future. Today, we are joined by Paul Maas, Fred Buscagllia, and Mark Benhar, and we are going to have a discussion regarding the supply chain and labor issues that have affected the tenant build-out process since the pandemic began. Paul and Fred both work at Jones Lang LaSalle, where Paul focuses on tenant representation during the office leasing process, and Fred specializes in project management during office build-outs. Mark is the president of Benhar Office Furnishings, where he works with clients to provide office furniture and other fixtures. So this should be a really interesting conversation as we are all involved at different levels of the process. Thank you, gentlemen, for joining me today.
Thanks, Jack.
Yeah,
Thank you. Nice seeing you.
This is a first in the history of the podcast, too. We've never had more than one person on, so it should be interesting, and I'm really excited about it. Paul, I'm going to start with you since you're at the top of this process, during the office leasing process. In the past, it would be common for people like myself and Fred and Mark to come to you for information, but since the start of the pandemic, you've really been coming to us to kind of get ahead of these supply chain issues and prepare tenants. How have you helped clients mitigate risk from the start of the fit-out process?
Well, thanks, Jack. I mean, the first thing is we learned that we needed to come to people like yourself and Mark. One of my colleagues, Lloyd DeSatnik, we were in the office, again, one of the advantages of being in the office, and he got off the phone with an owner he represented, and a deal was in jeopardy because the tenant realized their furniture was going to be very late. And we all started looking at each other and calling around, and Mark came in to speak to a group of us and really, gave us the explanation of what's going on. Ordinarily, pre-COVID, when everything was normal, we never got involved with that. It was very predictable. Same thing on the construction side for materials and what have you, and labor, which Fred will speak about. But, in order to advise a client, especially during wartime, when it's all chaotic, we had to get out of our comfort zone and get into a lot more detail up front to inform the tenant about the schedule.
Right. And as far as, that schedule, and Fred, this is where, you really come in because you are the one creating that schedule and again, giving those reasonable expectations. And we had kind of talked about this before and had this conversation. When you created that schedule at the beginning, that was a dictated schedule from the first week till the, 24th week. And now with the pandemic, when there's delays and stoppages and things of that nature, how did you start to kind of reanalyze what you were doing and come up with new processes to make sure that you're staying on budget, but also getting the job done within a reasonable time? Yeah.
So, we always predicated all these projects on, budget and schedule. And for the most part, we were reactive, to what the industry was showing us. So we knew design would take X number of weeks. We knew that bid and award would take X number of weeks, and then construction would take X number of weeks. And even during the pandemic, the early parts of the pandemic, we were still reacting to what the market was telling us, whether it was extending, whether there were certain procurement issues, supply chain issues, labor issues, government shutdowns. We were reactive. And over the course of that first 4 or 5 months, we then started to develop a system and a process to be proactive in the face of the pandemic, to deliver space in a more consistent manner without the uncertainties that were developing during the course of the early part of the pandemic. And that's where we started to engage Paul and Mark, earlier. So the more we were aligned, typically we would get through design, halfway through design, we'd start talking to furniture. They'd get through the lease signing, and Paul would kind of, then turn it over to the PM side of the business. And in reality, that was hindering us during the pandemic. What worked better is when we stayed together, understood the process early on, early engagement of all the different parties involved in the process, and that helped us mitigate some of the issues that developed during the pandemic.
Right, and that is part of the key. Communication became such an important function for all of our jobs, and from a consultative measure, we all have our specialties in what we do, but from a client standpoint, it really took a team effort to start communicating at a very early time, during that build out process, which again is why you started coming to us earlier and things of that nature. And Mark, I think that's one of the things we heard really often from people in furniture. They never liked getting involved in that process when they did to begin with, and always wanted to get in the front end. And this pandemic really kind of allowed for that, is to get them in the door earlier. So Mark, from your standpoint, from that consultative standpoint, how are you communicating with people like Fred and those project managers to, again, set those reasonable expectations, but also, find out what type of contingencies were in line or could take place, or who might be the better person to work with or manufacturer to work with or something like that. How are you communicating those early in the process?
Thank you. Yeah. I agree with Fred on a lot of the things he just said. And maybe we had to wait till the pandemic for us to be earlier on, something that we've been wanting and preaching for many years. But in all seriousness, getting involved early has been a game changer for our clients and stakeholders, so, where people can come together earlier and put their minds together for the success of the project. And I really feel that. I've felt that for years, even before the pandemic, so maybe this will be a great new trend. But certainly there's been a lot of challenges. Fred mentioned reactive. Yeah, I think for months we were all reactive. I've been in this business 35 years. I've never seen these types of challenges. And they're not gone. They're still here. And I think they're going to be here for, a while. I'm not sure what a while is, but the experts that I talk to certainly think until throughout the end of this year, early into next year. But getting involved early has been better. So what I've been basically trying to talk to our clients, my teammates, stakeholders like Paul and Fred and yourself is get us involved earlier. Furniture is a long process. There's a lot of things. It's not even the manufacturing of the furniture. It's the beginning process. There's so many things that go into picking furniture. You would think it's simple. I always make a joke like, I don't have a warehouse in Brooklyn and you can pick from white desks and black desks. I can have them to you tomorrow. There's a tremendous amount of specification and detail. If there's an architect involved, there's another layer as well, and that they're designing the space. They're going through showroom tours. They're picking furniture. There's a lot of choices. There's bidding. It becomes a very long process in the beginning before an order is even placed. So the challenge right now is that the lead times are so long, so prolonged, and the front end is always traditionally been so long. How do you look at it? How do you condense it? Going back to that, I think bringing in the professionals earlier and bringing in our firm and our competitors and the manufacturers earlier is one of the best things I can do. I also tell people now, please expect the unexpected. Mm-hmm. That's a mantra throughout our firm right now.
Yeah, certainly.
We could be as good. We have a lot of risk mitigating efforts that we're going through right now, but unfortunately, we're getting bad news on a daily, weekly basis as much as we put the effort into it. So the message really to clients and stakeholders are, we're going to do everything we can. We're going to be transparent with you, but expect the unexpected. And unfortunately, that happens.
And Mark, when you were, when you started this 30 years ago, even 15 years ago, 10 years ago, everybody just went on the basis of lead times.
Yeah.
No one really bothered to understand what those lead times really meant. And it's been an education now for a lot of our clients and a lot of the people in the industry, just what Mark said. It isn't a 6-week, 8-week lead time. It's now being very calculated about what the amount of time it takes to get to the point where you place an order. And those are some of the things that people were struggling with. They didn't realize, and we see this not just in furniture, but in the entire procurement process now. Someone says, okay, this is going to get delivered in 12 weeks. And you look at your schedule and say, 12 weeks is plenty. What they really mean, and what you really need to ask is, what do you need to do to get to the 12-week lead time? Who confirmed that 12-week lead time? Sometimes that lead time isn't confirmed till you've been through a several-week process, including shop drawings, approval, reiteration, redrawing some of the shop drawings, and then finally everyone says, oh, this is great. In some instances, now you got to get a PO, which could take some clients several days to get a PO. That's delaying your order until that PO happens. If you need a deposit, it's delaying that deposit. So now, where it was all done behind the scenes and we just explained, that's the way it happened, we now have to explain those things to people so they can understand why this early engagement is so important.
Right. And that's actually the question I had next, and we'll start with Paul on the answer, but then can lead down the line, is you said the specification process. And, at the time before the pandemic, you had just brought it up, specification wasn't a really word that you think about or even how long it took or anything like that. But, now because you're getting involved earlier, that specification process can be done more efficiently, and then you can get stuff out done, to process much easier. And what I wanted to ask both of you, but then also discuss with you from the landlord side and, that part of the process is when specifying certain items, like let's say millworking compared to furniture, compared to like tenant improvement, but on a landlord side, how are you communicating that? And are you going back to the table, Paul, on stuff, because of, certain specification lead times or certain tenant improvements that the landlord's agreeing to that, may delay what Fred's doing and what Mark are doing?
I learned a lot, a lot during this process, and got involved with minutia that I never had to before. And it wasn't just on furniture and construction, but it was also with the Department of Buildings and certificates of occupancy. And, doing construction, I have a client that is an essential business, and we did a deal at the end of 19. They did their construction all during the COVID period. And at the end of the day, we renegotiated part of the lease because of these unexpected delays that were really no one's fault, not the two parties. It was outside everyone's control. And fortunately, my tenants are a reasonable group, and they didn't order anything exotic, and so we could make the case after the fact that this is not a good way to start off a 15-year relationship. So we negotiated additional free rent again after the fact, but it was spread out over the term, so it wasn't up front. But it was also impacted by the fact that we were the first tenant in a newly renovated building.
Oh, yeah.
And so the landlord had more space to rent. I dare say if it were, a top of the market, newly constructed building that's being very competitive, I'm not sure a landlord would be so willing to negotiate that. But I think working with the tenant up front to understand, as Mark explained in our meeting, that a lot of times something gets specified, but it could be delayed, and he comes up with substitutes and things like that, which is really great advice, which is what the clients need at the front end in order to smooth the process.
Right.
And at the end of the day, that's what we're all looking for, is that really good advice, what makes sense. If I want to reach for something, then I have to live with it, obviously. But, I could see making that case to an owner and say, look, here's what we're doing. We're doing everything up front, and God forbid something happens down the line, we may come back and knock on the door.
Yeah, really interesting. And then again, for you, as well, from that specification process, delays are inevitable. It's the case now. You build them in, expect the unexpected, as Mark said. How were you working with GCs and kind of getting their bids together and seeing what they were doing with different specifications and simply, looking at this and saying, there's no way, there's no way this is going to happen. Please do this. This is what we're seeing. And, that's over the course of the pandemic, something you got really good at.
Yeah, and it just became honing of certain techniques that have been around for a while. And the most important one is, we used to call it a procurement log. Some people still do, but we've refined it to be more of, we call it an ROJ log, required on the job log. And what that does, it takes every finish that you have to purchase, every piece of furniture that you're buying, and you put it into a log that identifies in a construction schedule when that item is required on the job in order to make your schedule. And it no longer just includes the product and the lead time. It includes, where is that product being manufactured? When is the submittal due that allows you to order the product? Where is that being manufactured? How is it being shipped to the site? Where is it being shipped to? If it's being shipped somewhere other than the site, how is it getting from that location to the job? And if we add all those pieces together and we're not hitting the date that the contractor says it needs to be on the job, then we have to look at that item and decide whether that's the right item to purchase. And can we shift other things as part of that schedule? Look, it's happened forever, right? We never start a job with a schedule that we finish with. Doesn't happen,
Very
right?
true.
You know that. You guys all know that, right? You say you're going to have a lease signed by February 29th. Right, it's a leap year. Yeah, 4 years from now, maybe it gives you enough time. But realistically, that's not the way it's going to work. And we know we're changing it every single week. The deal is, are we changing it to the benefit of the client, or are we changing it because we have bad news for the client, where we're pushing everything out? And of course, you know this. The biggest issue when we miss dates are holdover costs, right? So you could have a lease that's expiring and you have everything timed perfectly. They can't move. They got to stay in their space. They could be spending 1.5 times their monthly rent. It doesn't matter if it's half of their monthly rent. Oftentimes there's a huge price to pay for that. So again, but I will caution you that all of this process, everything we do now to mitigate the potential issues that arise, come at a cost, right? So we haven't yet found a way to get a lot of the consultants and the contractors in line that even if you're engaged but not working, there's no real fee, because realistically, all of the consultants on the job get paid based on how long they're on the job. So if a general contractor says he's on the job 24 weeks, the job becomes 30 weeks. It's not just an extra 6 weeks. It's 6 weeks of general conditions, fees, insurance. That can be a fairly substantial amount of money. So we've mitigated by telling everybody up front that it's a 30-week project, not a 24-week project. In essence, the client's going to pay some more money. And we still have to work through that process of how we keep the contractors and the consultants in line in order to, if you will, lump sum their fees versus based on the weeks of the project. And we're still going through that process. But right now, many of us are focused on schedule. So schedule will sometimes trump cost. So that's
Is there
one
acceptance of this new way with the stakeholders that you're dealing with?
There is acceptance if they have a tight deadline on the back end of the project. And if they're up against, and sometimes it's not a lease expiration, sometimes it's just for financial reasons they have to spend the money by a certain point in time. So we get acceptance because people understand all the things that are happening now in the industry, that there is this uncertainty. So if we can buy certainty with a little bit of money, sometimes our clients are very willing to accept that. So They're paying us a little bit more for the fact that we can create some certainty in an uncertain market.
Right, certainly. And, that's kind of part of the process. And, when you're looking at that risk mitigation, or you're looking at that balance sheet, by spending a little bit more money on the front end, they could be saving a little bit on the back end or something like that. There's all different ways to look at that.
Right.
And then Mark too, and I want to get back to the lump sum cost or the lump sum budget, and how that is still the budget we're working with, but it could change the schedule a little bit. I think that's really smart. I want to come back. But Mark, one of the things I wanted to ask you too, when we're talking about that schedule, you're working with these manufacturers, and you've been in this business 30, 40 years. You've had these relationships for a long time. Seeing and working during the pandemic, how soon are they coming to you, and telling you that, okay, we told you a 6-week lead time or an 8-week lead time, but you know what? No. It's going to be another 4 weeks.
Not soon enough.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
So it's unfortunate, but it's the wild, wild west. It's getting a little bit more predictable over the last 4 to 6 weeks, I'd say, but the last 6 months probably it was really bad. We are doing proactive things to call the manufacturers much more often and check in with them on a regular basis. I actually just hired someone just to do that.
Wow.
I mean, we have a regular process in place of people calling and verifying, but I have one person that calls every week, every manufacturer for every purchase order, and we do the best we can to be on top of it. We're not always getting the right answer. We're not always getting the truth.
Right.
And that kills me. It's a matter of, I like to tell the truth. Like I was telling Fred this the other day that I'm sure there's vendors out there, I've seen it, where some of my competitors or even in other trades are just giving the answers that people want to hear, but they're not the truth.
I used to do it to my mother all the time.
Yeah. Your mother.
I still do.
Yeah. But, it gets you in a bad spot. So, we lost a deal maybe 3 months ago. We knew the manufacturer's lead time was 18 weeks, and we said 19 to 20. A competitor said 15. We said it's impossible to the client. They said, well, that's what they told us. We're going with it. Now, they're going to deal with it down the road in some way. Oh, blah, 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 blah. I don't do it that way.
Right.
But it is frustrating on our end, getting this bad news and people not telling the truth. Maybe they're not telling the truth because they don't know the truth. I'm sure that is the fact on a lot of these manufacturers. They're dealing with a lot of moving parts.
Certainly.
You know, it was materials. Things have shifted a little bit, but materials were big. Shipping, still a big issue. COVID. And now, more than ever, labor.
Right.
So I'm at all four coming together. So it's like plugging holes. That's basically what my manufacturers are saying to me. And they all have good intent. I know that. But we to answer your direct question, we're still sometimes getting disappointing news a week or two before it was supposed to be here.
Right.
Imagine the stress that it creates for the project, for the client, for us, that we were told that we're going to be moving in, say, April 1st, and everything's shipping March 1st. And on February 25th, I get a uh-oh call that it's going to be 3 weeks, 4 weeks later, with really not the best explanation. Why? What do I tell my client? Well, we're just late. It didn't come. That. It's not one thing. It's not one thing. A few weeks ago, Omicron hit a certain area, and they had labor shortages. Another time, they didn't get things from China. It's just so much going on. So, to answer your question, it's been tough. It's getting a little bit more predictable. The other thing, going back to something you said before, is that in my business, that we have many manufacturers we represent.
Right.
And there are some that have been a little bit more predictable than others.
Right.
It's my job to try to inform our clients and stakeholders who we feel are more on top of this supply chain issue, who has more control, who's a little bit more predictable, and for our money where we'd go. So we're trying to do that a lot. A lot of people are open to it, but on certain jobs, people want what they want, and they're not willing to necessarily budge. And at that point, the schedule is the schedule, and we have to be more on top of that. So we try as consultants to recommend alternates and stuff for lead times, but it doesn't always come to bear. Yeah,
certainly. And, I just want to stress, too, that is something a lot of times, most of the time, really, completely out of your control. And, I deal with it in my business, too. And obviously, you have to be the one to go back to the Fred and the client and tell them this is what we're dealing with. But I think you'd agree, we're solutions people. So what type of solutions, are you coming up with? And Fred, again, in your position, how are you, when you get those calls, working within that lump sum budget to make it work? Are we getting, whether it's new fixtures? And again, this also brings me back to the specification process. It's one thing to specificate furniture. And another would be, though, like, millworking and, like, custom pieces such as this, and stuff like that. How have you kind of worked around that within the budget to make it work for the client and, still meet everybody's expectations?
Yeah, we used to do that a lot. We used to have a discussion with guys like Mark and say, okay, here's millwork, here's furniture. What's the best lead time? What's the best solution? Sometimes it's cost, sometimes it's lead time. Early part of the pandemic, we knew that millwork was a better deal than furniture was because we were seeing huge delays in furniture. Over time in New York City, especially as the millworking trade, that trade was highly susceptible to COVID. There was a lot of closures of millwork fabrication places where they just didn't have the manpower. And they also had a lot of people who chose not to actually come to work. There were, second, third generation woodworkers, carpenters who decided that it was too risky for them to come. And the problem we started to see is that the production was slow, but even more so than that, the installation was slow. Installation teams didn't want to come to site. The production guys in the factory would show up. They'd start producing things at a slower rate. There was no one to install it. There was getting backup. We saw that on P-lamp cabinets for kitchens and for pantries. We saw all of these things starting to come together as a mass and say, well, we have a problem. It's no longer just we can't get PLAN, we can't get the wood, we can't get the chips for the appliances. We now had to blend all of that into an overall project schedule. And the solutions were different on every job because we had, we'd work with Mark on one and he'd get temporary furniture in place. We had manufacturers that were taking furniture out of their showrooms to temporarily put in someone's office so they could open and start, and show their office was ready to occupy. But those are little things. Those weren't real. Those were Band-Aids. Those weren't solving the problem. And the problem really comes from this idea of setting it up front for everybody to realize, clients especially, right? Working with the brokers, like I'm constantly harping on Paul and his colleagues about, why do you guys wait so long to get us involved? Like, why do you think you can go through this process and then at the end hand it to us? And sometimes we're the bearer of bad news. We're the guys that say, oh, I know Paul just told you you'd be in by July. You're really looking at October, right? And that makes the client upset. It could potentially make Paul look bad. It makes us all look bad. So why do we want to put ourselves in that position? And that's what we do now across the board. It's about engaging, finding the people working. Look, we keep track of the contractors, subcontractors. We know what subcontractors are working on in the city. We know who's busy. When we give them this required on the job log at the bid time, and we say to the mill worker or the installer that your product has to be here and installed by this date, they have to buy the job on that date. And if they have to, and we don't know necessarily whether they're committing premium time to that schedule or they're doing on straight time, but at least we have the number and we've given them a date, and that date has to be met under the terms of the contract. Now, one would say, what happens if they don't meet it? Okay, they don't meet it, but there is some repercussion and there is some cost available, some liquidated damages for, if we had to go that direction. But we're now managing subcontractors. We would let the contractors choose their subs. We now have a direct hand in what subcontractors they're picking because we know the ones that have not delivered on their jobs. We can look at furniture manufacturers now and say, Mark, stay away from this company because we've had nothing but problem. We go, yeah, I know. And then we talk to the architect. We tell the architect, stay away from this manufacturer. So we can then start to manage it, proactively rather than try and bring that bad news to the client at the end of the day.
Right, and that kind of brings up, you brought it up about everybody wants to get in the room earlier, which we completely understand, and we are doing a very good job of.
We need Paul to get the tenant to do that.
Yeah. Well, that's actually what I was going to ask. JLL and all of their resources. Paul, when you're in every client is unique. We all know that too. But when you're working with these specific clients, and you see the space that they're looking for, and if there needs a lot of work to be done, or they're going to be doing a lot of work, are you saying, okay, if you're thinking about this, maybe it's a good idea to sit down with our project management team. I don't know if it's necessarily before that deal is signed, or maybe it is. Maybe it's during the negotiation process, or maybe it's sitting down with the landlord. Is there that type of opportunity to do that? And do you think, that would be, a little taboo before the pandemic, but now, again, using JLL to your advantage, is that something you think, you can do, and have you done it to that effect?
For most of my career, I'd like to have all the experts lined up
right.
up front.
Right.
A client shouldn't take construction advice from me or furniture advice, although furniture I never thought was an issue until recently. And actually, one of my hedge fund clients was the first inkling of this problem. We did an office for them in London, and while we were doing the search, they ordered all of their trading equipment, all the tech gear, because the chip shortage and everything else. They didn't know about furniture yet, neither did I. But it's all somewhat related. But from the standpoint of securing one's career, you want to basically have as few surprises as possible. Mm-hmm. And I've always tried to work with project management up front to get them involved, because you know what? You can go to a cocktail party and two people can run into each other who just did office leases, and they'll say, this is what I paid for rent. What'd you pay? They won't say loss factor. They won't say how much free rent they got or how much work. But no one ever talks about construction, because it's so hard to really understand if you're not in it. And it's the one thing I think that for a lot of users, construction can go off the rails and the people in the company are forgiven, because it's not a science. So,
Yeah. Well, we're trying to create more of a science.
No,
Right, exactly.
I realize that. So
Yeah.
it's always been unpredictable. It's always been, an area of concern for me, for my clients. And, I just think being hands-on is a good thing. And frankly, I learn by working with people like this. They make me more effective up front. So,
Can I ask you a question? Since the pandemic and the supply chain issues, are you approaching certain size deals with landlords differently? I've heard from some of your associates that under a certain square footage, they're actually wanting the landlord to build it and own the schedule. And this way there's more predictability to that, and the free rent and all that comes into play, and that they have to hit a certain target date, and if they don't, then your tenant's more protected.
yeah, no, there's a lot of turnkey that's been going on. It started even before the pandemic, especially on the smaller side. I mean, if you think back into the day, years ago, that used to be the standard, and then, landlords were cutting corners and stuff, so tenants took back control by asking for work allowances.
Sure.
And then they self-managed. And, if you just look at the way the business is going, it's becoming, a little bit more hospitality-like, a little bit more, hey, you're the landlord, this is your business, real estate, you should be doing the construction, and so on and so forth. And we're seeing that, in the amenitized buildings and everything else like that. So I think especially for the smaller ones, and smaller,
What does small mean?
I did a 60,000 footer that was a turnkey.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah. But it was a heavily, my client was very knowledgeable about construction and comfortable with it, and had their longtime contractor at the table.
Oh, wow.
While the landlord, and it was a bear negotiating the lease language to make it work, but we got it.
We did a 200,000 square foot turnkey
Wow.
during the pandemic.
I don't think size, unless you get into the really big things, is going to be as much of a factor as, what owners have to do to secure the tenant.
Yeah. It's a competitive market like that. And, we're talking about building the space out and like getting that process done. But then the clients as a whole and these companies as a whole got to get the employees into the office, which is a completely different conversation and an entirely different episode. But while we're on the topic, Mark, you are in the design, process and part of that, portion of the job. Have you been seeing anything creative by clients, or have you been suggesting anything creative by clients to kind of help, retention or, safety, whatever the many trials that we've been dealing with?
So there was a period during COVID where safety was a big concern. No one knew exactly what this virus was, so there was a mad dash to put screens and plexi up, and a lot of people did it.
We made a lot of money putting those up and taking them down.
Right. that was short-lived.
Storing them.
Yeah, exactly, exactly.
That was short-lived, maybe 6 months. Might be a few people asking once in a while now, but from a safety standpoint, I think that we know more about the virus now. Amazingly, I have not seen a tremendous change in design post-COVID to prior COVID. There are some things, and I'll clarify, but prior to COVID, we were going to much more open, collaborative spaces, more residential looking, more breakout areas, these phone booths and stuff. This trend started. It's just accelerated it now where people are doing that. I would say that even in my own firm, to get people back, our clients are thinking about the space a little differently. They want to make it unique. They want to put more amenities in. They are thinking about this. What's going to bring an employee back to the office to want to come back? Because there's that balance. Some people want them back, some people not. But to get them back, you should design a nice space. So I am seeing an emphasis on that. As far as it changing drastically prior to COVID to post-COVID, not. Maybe a few more Zoom rooms and collaborative rooms. My firm, we went to a hybrid work environment over the last 6 months, so we'll have less dedicated desks. But again, a lot of these trends I saw prior to COVID as well.
Right, exactly. And, any existing clients that either of you may have had, did you see them, take more space to kind of create more room, or, limit their footprint simply because, they were going to more of a hybrid situation?
Well, I mean, I think hybrid is here to stay.
Oh, yeah, certainly.
Yeah. And I think it's a much nicer environment in a slightly smaller footprint is what I'm seeing. I mean, look, I've been through enough of these cycles, and successful companies don't shrink.
Yeah.
I mean, yeah, they may disperse over time, but if your business is going to stay in business, you're going to grow.
Yeah.
If you stand still, then chances are you'll be left behind. So I think it's hard to sometimes make these generalizations across the board.
Right.
I do think that, look, we have a high proportion of people here back in the office. And we benefited from the fact that when we came back, it was brand new space.
Right.
Which definitely made a difference.
Mm-hmm.
I do think over time, you're going to see a return. Anecdotally, I mean, this week I come into Grand Central. I've never seen it fuller.
I took the subway this morning.
Yeah.
It was packed.
Yeah, I think New York City has a lot of ambitious people, and if you're going to be ambitious about your career, you're probably hard to do that from home in a lot of businesses. It doesn't matter, and if you decide you want to stay home, well, I'm sure there's somebody that'll come take your cheese and be ambitious.
Right.
So I'm very optimistic about New York.
Yeah, and there's lots of businesses that grew exponentially during COVID.
Right.
Some of the social media companies went through the roof. There was a tremendous amount of growth. Now, personally, I had some of what I would consider to be the media companies that I represent who decided to take a pause when the pandemic started. They either were thinking about moving or expanding or renovating or had to move. And they actually calculated. Some of those smaller clients actually decided, you know what, I'm going to let my lease expire, everybody work from home. I'll roll the dice in a year about what the rents are and see if I come up better, right? But a lot of my financial clients did take an approach. I had one client who halted right when the pandemic started. A couple of months into it, guys like Paul, the brokers, were able to create a deal that made it financially advantageous for them to step back into the market. And they took, although less space than they were initially anticipating taking, they took it, and we built it out during the midst of COVID. The office was so well regarded that they decided to take another floor, and they're going to continue to grow. I had another client who we started at 200,000 square feet. It went down to 80,000 square feet. And within, 5 or 6 months, it was back up to 200,000 square feet. Now, interestingly enough, they're looking at another floor. We're finishing another floor for them, which will bring it up another 30,000 square feet. They only have 15% of their population in the office any one day. But they understand that their folks are going to come back. They're clamoring to come back, and they wanted to create this kind of new and improved space. Now, that industry isn't seen as much of the collaboration space as Mark and we may see in some of the other areas, but they're a little bit more traditionally based. And for one reason is that they like now the private office. They like the idea that no one else is in my space, right? So even from a pandemic perspective, we have seen a return in some of the financial institutions to a little bit less collaborative space and more private space, heads down workspace, and then cafes and a couple of other rooms that bring people together. But we're not building space now that it's public assembly over 75 people because people are still deeming that to be a little bit questionable and may consider that questionable going forward. So again, all of those things lend to the schedule and the budget of how these things come about. So it is a refinement, but it's definitely taken into consideration. Everybody's role has been kind of reevaluated in the process, right?
Most certainly. And that's what I'm going to kind of leave it on, is certainly we've discussed it today and we've all seen significant change to how we do our jobs, through the pandemic. What do you think is your biggest takeaway? And Paul, we'll start with you and can go down the line. What do you think is the biggest takeaway and the one thing you're going to take with you? And again, you actually made me think about it because of you said you've been through the peaks and valleys, and through all these peaks and valleys, I think you take something with you every time. What do you think you're going to take with you getting out of this? And let's please pray we're getting out of this, that you're going to take with you the rest of your career.
Good question. I think that that people are going to be more considerate in the workplace.
Yeah.
They're going to be more conscious of hygiene. And I think it's going to make for a much better environment going forward. I think those things, I just notice, you go to your deli or your coffee place and people are a lot more welcoming.
Yeah.
On both sides of the counter. And I think that's some consideration has come out of this, maybe if there's a silver lining.
Right. Yeah, very nice. Right, what about you?
Well, I had an answer, but now I feel bad about my answer, considering Paul's nice,
from the
hug it out,
altruistic
hug it out approach. I'm like,
So
I'm
he
the
is.
broker.
I'm the broker.
I can't say that now.
That's who he is.
Now I got to say something really nice. Yeah, we all come together better. No, I was actually, my thing was just going to be that we have to be more transparent with our clients and more transparent as an industry and how things get done and how we can work together. And yes, I agree. Like, we lived through 9/11. I was here in the city for 9/11, and the city had a much different feel for a year and a half after 9/11. And it slowly kind of returned to New York, right? I think, as Paul pointed out, and I think he's right, I think the pandemic has probably changed the way people interact in a business environment forever. I think it's not going to change. I think this is the new norm, if you will.
Yeah, certainly. Certainly, I agree. Mark, what about you? What do you think, is the most hopeful change for
got to go
you?
last.
I gotta get it last. I know. I agree with my friends over here, but comes to mind that obviously change is inevitable, right? We always knew that, but wow, this smacked us in the face, and something like this or something different, you have to be open that something like this can happen. Just be ready for change, and I think a lot of people, a lot of businesses did pivot well in this era and learn from that. I know we did. And the other thing that came out of this that I think is a good thing for everyone is flexibility. I know that as a leader, I had to be flexible. And I have managers that might have been in a different mode. We all maybe a little old-fashioned, command and control in the way that we managed before. And we were making some changes even before COVID, but this accelerated that. So the flexibility to give employees the work-life balance, trusting people that they're going to get their work done, they're going to be responsible to each other, to our clients and stakeholders, has really been eye-opening for me and my management team, and it's here to stay for us, there's no doubt.
Yeah, nice. Well, gentlemen, thank you all very much for doing this. Like I said before, this was a first for me, so I appreciate you trusting us to do this, right for you. And I think it was really great. I appreciate you all coming on. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Jack.
All right, guys.
Thank you,
Thanks so
Jack.
much, Jack.
This is great. Take care, everybody. Thank you for listening.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.